At Denver International, under those cold terminal lights, I learned exactly how far my family was willing to go to keep me in my place. My flight paid with the card my mother insisted I use for reward points had been canceled and refunded to her without my knowledge. Then the texts hit loser. Take the bus. And somewhere behind those words, I could hear Brooke's laugh, the same laugh she let out after hacking my email to expose a trip I never told her about. I thought the humiliation was the worst part. But what they didn't know was that their little stunt had just unlocked the one power they never meant for me to find. Before I go on, tell me where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you. Not the loud betrayals, the quiet ones. The ones that make you doubt your place in your own family. Your support helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. People assume quiet people grow up in quiet homes. Mine wasn't quiet, it was strategic. Every smile was rehearsed, every compliment had an audience, and every photo on the wall was of Brooke. Our house in Aurora looked normal from the outside, but step through the door and you could feel the temperature drop. Not from the air, from the way my parents looked at me like I was a placeholder in someone else's life. Brooke's 7th birthday is the first memory that ever stuck. A princess cake tall enough to tower over me, 30 kids running through the living room, the whole neighborhood invited. My birthday that same year. A supermarket cake with the wrong spelling shoved on a paper plate next to the sink, because we're tight this month, Avery. I didn't cry. I just learned the rule celebrations were for Brooke, survival was for me. Winters made everything worse. Colorado snow crept under the doorframes and into your bones, especially the night Brooke broke our grandmother's vase and blamed me before I even walked into the room. Richard didn't blink. Get out until you can learn some respect. I was 14, standing outside with a trash bag and snow melting into my shoes. Marlene opened the door an hour later and whispered, "Next time, don't embarrass us." That wasn't discipline. That was hierarchy. By high school, I'd stopped hoping for fairness, but I still hoped for recognition. When I earned a full scholarship, I rushed home with the acceptance letter shaking in my hands. Marlene didn't look up from her magazine. Good. Now we don't have to waste money on you. Richard added, "Life's easier when you stay quiet." That was the moment I understood silence was the only version of me they approved of. But nothing rewired me like the day Marlene curled my hair for the Collins family barbecue across the street. She called me sweetheart, told me to smile, placed her hand on my shoulder, with this soft pressure I mistook for affection. Years later, I overheard her tell Brooke she only did it because people talk, and we can't look like we favor just one child. That sentence didn't just break a memory, it rewrote all of them. Still, I tried to earn a place in their house. Part-time jobs after school, slipping 20s into the grocery jar, babysitting Brooke's friends, cooking dinner, when Marlene was overwhelmed. I thought giving more would eventually equal being wanted. I was wrong. All it did was train them to take without hesitation. Leaving for college was the first decision I made for myself. I didn't pack dreams, only clothes and a secondhand laptop. I studied financial planning in a library that smelled like old carpet and burnt popcorn. Nights were long, money was short, and the phone calls from Aurora always came with some variation of "we need your help." And I gave it. Not because I owed them. Because I still believed that being useful might one day turn into being loved. It never did. Instead, every dollar I sent home every weekend, I gave up every boundary I softened, they all turned into something I never expected, a paper trail. One I didn't know I would need. Graduating should have felt like a milestone, but I walked across that stage, knowing no one from Aurora would clap for me. I didn't invite them. I wasn't going to wear my cap and gown waiting for faces that only showed up when it made them look good. Instead, I moved into a cramped studio near Sloan Lake. Uneven floors, thin walls, a secondhand mattress. It wasn't much, but it didn't judge me. Didn't compare me to Brooke, didn't tell me to stay quiet. That alone made it feel like luxury. Then Eli arrived and everything shifted. The first time I held him wrapped in a hospital blanket, his tiny fingers curling around mine, I felt something I didn't recognize at first: safety. Not because the world was safe, but because loving him made me brave. I didn't want my son learning the same lessons I did. I didn't want him shrinking to fit inside someone else's limits. So I kept my distance from Aurora, hoping maybe distance could break a cycle. But cycles have a way of hunting you down. For Eli's 3rd Thanksgiving, I tried again. He'd asked if Grandma could see his robot set it with this bright, trusting smile that made my chest ache. So we drove to the house I once memorized blindfolded. The lemon cleaner smell was still there, coating my throat. Brooke's kids tore around the living room in matching outfits, and Richard looked at them with a softness I'd never seen directed at Eli. There were 8 chairs at the dining table, 7 filled. When I asked where Eli should sit, Marlene waved a dismissive hand. "Kids don't need chairs, just make space on the floor." Brooke laughed. Eli lowered himself onto the hardwood, balancing his plate carefully. Something inside me bent quietly, almost politely, but it didn't break. Not yet. Christmas was worse. Brooke unwrapped a new camera for content, while Eli opened a plastic truck with a missing wheel because money's tight this year. A week later, Richard called, asking if I could chip in for property taxes. I was still paying off my hospital bills from giving birth, but I said I'd see what I could do. That was always my line. I'll see, I'll help, I'll manage, and they let me. I didn't realize then that every act of generosity was being matched by an act of manipulation. That every time I softened, they sharpened. That every time I made space for them, they took more. By the time I bought a small condo with a view of the lake, they barely asked how I managed it. "Probably some cheap loan," Brooke muttered once. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear, soft enough to pretend it wasn't an insult. I ignored it. I was used to ignoring. But even then, even with all the small wounds collecting in the corners of my life, I didn't see the larger pattern forming. I didn't see how entitlement turns into expectation, how expectation turns into ownership, how ownership turns into abuse. The last time I visited their house before everything fell apart, I carried a grocery bag and a receipt Marlene demanded I drop off. Brooke posed in front of her ring light. Richard stared at the TV. Marlene didn't say thank you. I left my bag by the entryway for just a moment long enough for the baby monitor inside to switch on. I didn't listen to the recording until the morning of my canceled flight. When I pressed play, their voices didn't just reveal the truth. They rewrote my entire childhood in a single breath. And for the first time in my life, I stopped excusing the things that broke me. Trouble didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through small irregularities, tiny shifts that didn't make sense until they did. The first sign was a missing email. I searched my inbox for the travel confirmation I knew I'd received. Gone. Not archived, not deleted, just vanished. The kind of disappearance that doesn't happen by mistake. 2 days later, Marlene called with a question too casual to be innocent. Going anywhere this week, her tone had that sugary edge she used when she thought she was smarter than everyone else. No, I said. She hummed like she'd caught me anyway. I hung up with this tightness in my stomach, the feeling you get right before you realize the trap was set long before you stepped into it. Then came Eli's birthday. He wanted something small: balloons, cupcakes, a robot he'd been saving his tooth fairy money for. I invited them because he asked, because he didn't know any better and I didn't have the heart to teach him cruelty this early. They arrived an hour late. Marlene handed over a gift bag still crinkled with the store sticker. Brooke breezed in like my home was just better lighting for her feed. She didn't bend down to greet Eli, didn't even look at him. When he tore open the bag, he pulled out socks. 6 pairs, all identical, still taped together. Brooke filmed his expression like it was funny. Marlene shrugged. Kids don't need clutter. Eli looked up at me with this polite little smile he'd learned far too young. I thanked them anyway, because that's what they expected, and because I didn't want him to see the truth just yet. But truth has sharp elbows. It always finds a way. A week later, Tyler called me. I could count on one hand the times he'd ever spoken directly to me. His voice was clipped, furious. Did you know Brooke pulled $1,000 from our joint account? No, I said. Why would she tell me that? She said it was for a business expense. I could hear him pacing, but I found the transfer. It went straight to your mom. My pulse jumped. For what? She wouldn't say. Thought you might know. I didn't. But the unease in my chest told me I was about to. That unease became dread when a letter arrived in my mailbox a few days later. A loan company envelope, my name printed across the front. Inside a notice about an unpaid balance. I read it twice, then a third time. My parents had used my address, my legal residence, to register a loan they'd defaulted on. They hadn't asked. They hadn't warned me. They'd simply assumed my name was theirs to use. I called Richard immediately. Did you use my address for something? He didn't hesitate. We needed it. It's my home, I said. You can't. You weren't using the address for anything important, he snapped. Don't be dramatic. He hung up. I stared at my reflection in the blank TV screen, the dark glass holding a version of myself I hardly recognized. That's when it hit me, not in a cinematic flash, but in a slow tightening in my ribs. This wasn't chaos. This was coordination. This was entitlement woven so tightly it had become instinct. Still, I tried to breathe through it. Until the airport. DIA was buzzing with travelers, the air smelling like burnt espresso and winter jackets. For the first time in months, I felt a small lift in my chest. I'd planned a break. A quiet escape. But when the agent scanned my ticket, her expression shifted. Your booking shows. Cancelled, she said gently. Refund processed this morning. To what card, I asked, though I already knew. Ending in 0914, my mother's card. The world didn't explode. It simply narrowed into a point so sharp I could barely stand still. Then my phone buzzed. Loser. Take the bus. Maybe next time don't act like you're better than your family. Each message landed like a fingertip, pressing harder and harder on a bruise I'd carried all my life. I stepped away from the counter, chest tight, fighting the instinct to disappear. That's when a car rolled up the window, lowering just enough for a voice to ask, "You all right?" I wasn't, but I was about to be. I didn't answer the driver right away. I just stood there, my hand trembling around my phone, those texts burning like acid on my screen. He leaned slightly toward me, not invading, just reading, the kind of silence that comes right after someone hits the ground emotionally. "Name's Logan," he said. "You look like someone's day just collapsed." A weak breath escaped me. It did. Get in. I'm off shift anyway. Maybe it was the cold slicing through my coat. Maybe it was how steady his voice sounded in a world that had just tilted. But I got in. The heater hummed softly. The car smelled like pine and worn leather seats, the kind of scent that makes you feel safe in spite of yourself. At first I planned to say nothing. But the human heart is weak when someone finally treats you like it deserves gentleness. "My mom canceled my ticket," I murmured. He didn't react with shock or pity. He just nodded once. Family can be brutal. She refunded it to her own card, and then she sent texts. Bad enough. How bad it asked. Bad enough that the airport felt warmer than going home. The car rolled through the city while I told him everything, and missing email broke back into my account, the socks for Eli, the loneliness, the years of being used like a backup generator for a family that never ran out of excuses. When the car finally stopped near a quiet, snow-covered park, he turned off the engine. His tone shifted, not softer, but clearer. "I used to work at a law firm, landlord-tenant stuff. Paper trails, disputes. If everything you're telling me is real, You're not powerless, Avery. I blinked. What are you saying? I'm saying people act different when they think you don't know your rights. He tapped the steering wheel. And it sounds like you've got more leverage than they ever imagined. Something in me steadied. For the first time all day, the world stopped spinning. The panic didn't disappear. It crystallized into anger that finally had edges. Thank you, I said. You don't owe me anything. Just stop letting them write your story. When he dropped me off at my condo, the hallway lights seemed warmer than usual, like they softened just enough for me to breathe without shaking. Eli's artwork covered the fridge. His slippers were by the couch. The smallness of our home no longer felt like lack, it felt like ours. I opened my laptop. The folder labeled options had been sitting there for months, ignored because I thought peace came from forgiving, not confronting. Inside rows of documents appeared payment logs, investment notes, and the trust deed. The one proving the Aurora house belonged to a trust in my name. Elmwood Creek Trust. They thought it was a management company. They never asked. They never cared. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as another realization hit me. Every late payment they'd complained about, every time they'd hinted I didn't understand responsibility, every lecture Richard gave me about being grateful, all while they were late on my mortgage. I clicked another file. Audio lot entryway, visit, web. The sound filled my condo like a truth I had run from my whole life. Brooke's voice first. She should thank us for giving her a reason to stay in her place. Marlene followed. Cancel it, she's too confident lately. Then Richard chuckling. Make her take the bus. Might humble her. Their laughter was casual, light, like discussing weather, not their daughter. Then came something worse. Marlene's voice lower, quieter. We should talk to the lawyer about removing her from everything. She doesn't contribute to this family. The irony nearly choked me. Not contribute, I'd carried them financially for years. They knew that. They just didn't care. The recording continued, plans, complaints, their eagerness to watch me struggle. When it ended, I didn't cry. I replayed it. Twice. Then I moved the file into a new folder and renamed it Evidence. My hands were steady now. Too steady. They hadn't pushed me out. They had pushed me into focus. I opened a browser, typed Colorado eviction process timeline. Line by line I read. Deadline requirements, tenant obligations, enforcement rights. When I closed the laptop, one truth settled into my bones like a click of a lock. They thought they broke me at the airport, but all they did was make sure I finally understood the difference between being small and being underestimated. 3 days later, I drove back to the Aurora house, the place that had shaped me, silenced me, and convinced me for years that love had conditions I'd never meet. Snow dusted the yard. The porch light flickered like it always had, dim and tired. The house looked small from the outside. I finally realized it had always been small. It was my fear that made it look bigger. I walked up the steps with a steadiness I didn't have when I lived here. I wasn't coming as a daughter. I was coming as the owner. The door wasn't locked. It never was. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The same smells hit me, lemon cleaner, layered over sour coffee. Brooke perched at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone. Marlene sat stiffly on the couch. Richard was making a sandwich at the counter like nothing in the world could ever threaten him. Marlene barely glanced up. Avery, what could you possibly want now? Brooke smirked without looking away from her screen. Thought you'd still be crying at the airport. Richard didn't bother to turn around. Whatever drama you're bringing, leave it outside. Their voices didn't sting this time. They sounded small, predictable. A script I'd heard so often I could recite it myself. I set my bag on the hardwood floor, pulled out 3 white envelopes, and placed them on the island, one in front of each of them. Brooke blinked. What's this supposed to be? Notices, I said. For all of you. Marlene laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Notices for what? Eviction? It was quiet for one full beat. Then Brooke scoffed. You're insane. Richard finally turned. You can't evict family. You're not my tenants because you're family, I said. You're my tenants because you signed a lease. Their heads snapped up in unison. I placed the trust deed on the counter. Elmwood Creek Trust is mine. This house is mine. Has been for 2 years. Brooke's jaw dropped. You don't have the money. I cut her off by placing their signed lease agreements beside it. You never read them. You never asked who owned the trust. You just assumed you were above paperwork. Richard's face darkened. Even if what you're claiming is real, you don't have cause. So I pressed play. Their own voices filled the kitchen, clear, sharp, impossible to dismiss. Brooke, she should thank us for giving her a reason to stay in her place. Marlene. Cancel it. She's getting too bold. Richard. Make her take the bus. The laughter that followed sounded colder played back than it ever did live. Marlene grabbed the counter like she needed it to stay upright. Richard froze mid-breath. Brooke's face drained its influencer glow. And then another voice cut through the tension. Tyler's. He walked in from the hallway, snow melting on his jacket. Brooke, you stole money from me to pay their late rent. Brooke spun around. Tyler, listen. He looked at me. They're behind, aren't they? Yes, I said. Something inside Brooke cracked, hard. I pulled out one final document, the enforcement notice, the one already filed. You have 3 days, I said quietly. Sheriff will handle the rest. Marlene's voice shook. Avery, we didn't mean. I stepped back toward the door. You meant every word I said. You just never expected consequences. And for the first time in my life I watched them fall silent, not because they won, but because I finally stopped losing. The 3 days passed like a bruise spreading across skin, slow, dark, impossible to ignore. On Thursday morning, frost clung to the porch rails as a sheriff's cruiser rolled up the street. No flashing lights, no drama. Just the quiet certainty of the law stepping exactly where it needed to. Marlene and Richard stood on the porch with half-packed boxes, stunned in a way I'd never seen. Not guilty, not sorry. Just shocked that the world finally refused to bend for them. Brooke wasn't there. She'd stormed out the night before, dragging 2 suitcases down the driveway, shouting into her phone at Tyler, who didn't follow her. Even her kids weren't with her. They were staying with Tyler's mother until things settled. I wasn't sure what settling looked like for Brooke. I wasn't sure she knew either. The sheriff moved through the house with calm authority, explaining each step. I stayed by the walkway, Eli's small fingers hooked around mine. He didn't understand eviction. He just knew this house had never felt like a place he belonged, and he didn't want me walking inside alone. At one point, Marlene approached me, tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. Avery, please, we're still your parents. I stepped back. And I was your daughter. That didn't protect me. She blinked, stunned by the simplicity of it. Maybe all abusers expect long speeches, long explanations. I gave her neither. Movers carried out boxes, some labeled carefully, some hastily taped shut. Years of entitlement packed into cardboard. Years of silence exposed in daylight. When the house was finally empty, the sheriff handed me the key. All set. I walked inside alone. The lemon cleaner smell was fading. The rooms felt smaller without their voices bouncing off the walls. For the first time, this place felt like a house instead of a stage. I placed a small box on the kitchen counter, a counter where I had once stood being told I should be grateful. Inside the box was a single photo, Eli and me, by Sloan Lake sunlight on our faces. On the back of the photo, I'd written 2 words, "Not anymore." I locked the door behind me. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Brooke, we need to talk. I didn't open it. I didn't delete it either. Because the eviction wasn't the end. It was the clearing of the board. And now that everything was finally quiet, I could hear every weapon they'd ever handed me, every recording, every loan document, every hacked email. All the things they thought I'd never be brave enough to use. The truth was simple. I wasn't done. Not even close. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, hit subscribe. Stories like mine aren't just stories, they're reminders that silence isn't the same as peace, and loyalty doesn't mean letting people break you. And trust me, this isn't over. What happened in that house was only the beginning of what I had to uncover. If you've carried wounds no one else could see, if you've learned to smile through rooms that never welcomed you, stay with me. There's more to expose, more to reclaim, and I'm not done yet. Maybe, neither are you.